The starting point of the book is in some ways a reflection on a seemingly rhetorical question: did the First World War end on the 11th of November 1918? And in some ways I'm playing with the idea of chronologies here. I'm suggesting that the traditional idea of the First World War as a conflict that starts in 1914 and ends neatly in November 1918 is a very Western perspective, particularly a British and French perspective. But I'm contesting here that for most other combatant states of the First World War, this chronology doesn't make any sense at all. Particularly, it doesn't make sense for many of the states east of the Rhine River, states that experience massive violence in the years that follow November 1918. So it matters whether you find yourself in Rome or Paris or London, or indeed in cities like Riga or St. Petersburg. For large parts of Europe, 1918 doesn't bring peace, only a continuation of violence. It is here in the East where violence continues unabated for many years, notably until 1923. And it's a period in which at least 4.5 million people lose their lives as a result of violent clashes. So more people die after the official end of the First World War than British, French and American soldiers during the conflict. One of the central themes is the transformation of Europe as a continent which until 1914 had been dominated by land empires and, of course, in the case of Britain and France, blue water empires, into a continent in 1918 that is suddenly dominated by nation states. Essentially all of East Central Europe, the lands of the bygone empires of the Romanovs, the Hohenzollern and the Habsburgs, also of the Ottoman Empire, are transformed into regions and nation states that basically want to distance themselves from their imperial past. On the one hand, they aspire to being ethnically homogeneous states, but at the same time they are pretty much as ethnically and religiously diverse as the imperial states from which they emerged. One of the very few good things that came out of the Paris Peace Conference are the so-called minorities treaties. So every newly emerging state, in order to be recognized internationally, has to sign one of the minorities treaties in order to protect the very sizable minorities that exist within. Unfortunately, however, by 1923, the international community gradually changes its mind on the issue. So while in 1918, people like US President Woodrow Wilson advocated to preserve diversity, by 1923, with the Treaty of Lausanne, they basically agree that the only way to preserve peace is to separate the different groups. It's the first time that expulsions are state-sanctioned. What we see here is something that is actually pointing into a terrible future, where states like Nazi Germany after 1933 assume that in these newly occupied spaces after 1941 they have to unweave the ethnicities. So this is a very important, I think, development of ideas of how to deal with minorities that is one of the fateful legacies of the First World War. Well, the ways in which historians address the past and write about the past obviously changes over time. And for a very long time, the predominant approach in history writing was to focus on national history. So as if the nation existed in a vacuum. And it's only really in the last 10-15 years that historians are taking much more seriously the sort of transnational, pan-European or even global perspectives and try to weave their own kind of national history into the bigger picture. So more and more histories of the First World War are actually written as global histories, but this would be the first general history of the end of the war that considers national histories within a broader European context.